So just to try and kick things off, can I have like a show of hands who does like any kind of front-end web stuff at all? So I'm guessing that's more than half of you. Okay, keep your hand up if you use Redux. My hand also stays up. And if you've ever used MobX State Tree, hand up. Okay, cool. So you two, I want no shouty-eyed or correcty of me. You keep that silent and then tell me at the end. Cool. So the message of this talk is kind of that Redux is it is pretty good. It's particularly good in theory, and I think it's really awesome in languages and environments which really support it. So things like Elm, Reason, F#, they work really nicely with that kind of model view update pattern, where you have a model, you have a function which maps that to a view, and you have some way of doing updates in an immutable way. However, in JavaScript, it has some downsides, which I will get onto. But there is an alternative, which is what I want to talk about, MobX State Tree. It has the advantages of Redux, but it is so much more concise. It is so much more idiomatic. It feels like you're actually writing JavaScript, not trying to emulate features of Elm or F# or whatever in JavaScript. It plays generally better with TypeScript. It is certainly a lot less effort. You don't have to write out a whole bunch of extra types for your actions, for example. It's also much more composable. So Redux kind of has this weird structure that has to be a kind of global thing and kind of encourages a kind of flatness and top-levelness of everything. With MobX State Tree, you can have trees and you have natural kind of structures that you might be familiar with from other environments. And in conclusion, if you're doing a new project in particular, please seriously consider using MobX State Tree for the reasons I will explain in more detail. So the metaphor I think of in a lot of these kind of contexts, and this works in lots of places, it's like you have some big landscape, you want to climb to the highest point, and it's really easy to like look at Flux and Redux and think, oh yes, Redux is nicer than Flux. It's a bit simpler and easier to work with, and I can use this. But then there's this other massive mountain, which is much taller, MobX State Tree, which does things better, but it's harder. You have to kind of go down and relearn some things to get there. As an example, I built this app, which is a color picker using MobX State Tree. You might kind of recognize the overall structure. It's kind of similar to like every Redux example, which is like a to-do list, but it has colors, and so it's a lot nicer. So we can add colors, we can give this a name, we can change it, we can change the name, we can adjust the hue, saturation, and lightness. By the way, never use RGB, always use HSL or HSB or some kind of color system that actually makes sense for humans rather than computers. Random piece of advice. You can copy existing colors, you can change things. There's also, I've only done a couple of these so far, but you can get outputs of these colors in a format that you can then drop into an actual project. So it's trying to be a kind of little useful tool. I kind of sort of extracted this from a React Native app I made, but it's kind of, it went in a kind of a different direction. So, but the point of this app, it's like it has sufficient complexity to start to think about some of the real concerns we encounter in like real apps. But it's also kind of simple and self-contained enough to actually talk about in a short talk. So, yeah, I think I've said all of that. So I'll try and give a very brief kind of flavor of MobX State Tree. I'm leaving out lots of details. You can read about all that stuff afterwards. With MobX State Tree, we define types. In this case, there are two types. One is a color, and one is the overall state of the application. This is kind of familiar, should be familiar if you used various kinds of schema definition things in various other languages and contexts. You have numbers, you have strings, you can have constants. In this case, you can have like an array of colors, so these other objects. So we can kind of come up with a nice way of modeling our data that kind of that is close to the domain, not like Redux, perhaps. Anyway, so to create a tree, we just pass it. One way of doing it is to pass in a bunch of JavaScript object which matches that structure, and it will be validated by MobX State Tree. But how do you do stuff? And this is where it like completely destroys Redux. It is so much more pleasant. So the magic trick from MobX State Tree, which it is magic. I mean, it's actually using ES6 proxies, and you can read about the implementation. But basically, you get to write standard JavaScript code. You mutate stuff. In this little example here, to like set the hue, you just set the hue to a new value. There's no having to destructure it like Redux, where I take the existing state, do the trickle dot thing, then do the hue, colon equals the thing, which is inside a reducer. So in this application, I ended up with 17 update actions, which would have been absolutely horrifying to do in Redux. For something that's quite small, having 17 different updates in Redux is really tedious. So let's say we're doing Redux properly, like modern serious developers, and using TypeScript or Flow. So we have type definitions, we have action creators, we have a reducer. And in this case, it's kind of bad because most of these updates are to colors. They're not to the top level thing. They're to a thing within a collection. So we're having to do an extra chunk of destructuring for every single one of these updates. So in the spirit of 2018 and post-truth and stuff, I made up some numbers to demonstrate how much how superior MobX State Tree would be to Redux. So the Redux figure is actually correct. This is like 80 lines of code to do all of these 17 different updates, 17 different ways of updating the model that are immutable, that preserve the history, that can do clever stuff. Versus what I would guess the Redux would be. I've done similar things. I don't think that's an unreasonable estimate. I'm going to be fairly confident it'd be between 600 and 1,000 lines of code to do the same stuff. So we're talking about an order of magnitude saving here. And I think this amount of code is really important, not just in terms of writing it, because maybe you could generate some of it, but in terms of when you come to change it, when you maintain it, the possibility of introducing bugs. That's like a huge win. One of the other things of Redux that I've sort of mentioned a bit before is that it forces you to keep things very flat. So you kind of keep your data in a normalized way, which doesn't actually reflect your domain. So you introduce a new library like reselect, which then takes this normalized stuff and then maps it into the stuff the way you actually want to work with the data. But MobX State Tree has something built in to do this already, and again, it's much more concise. So you can kind of define this views thing, which maps your state to derived data. And it will also automatically memwise this, so it knows when you've changed one of the things that goes into this underlying thing, and it will update that selectively rather than updating everything all the time. It's actually very reactive, so it co-locates all of these things I've talked about into like one file. So in one chunk of code, we define a model schema, we define views on that model, and we define actions or updates in that model. It's very, very clear. So I can go in and read this in one place and understand what's going on. To connect it to your like React application, I assume to other front-end frameworks. I haven't used it in that context. I'm not actually sure if it works there. Use the add observer annotation from MobX, or you can use a function form of that. It's fairly simple. It is a bit easy to forget to do that. I mean, I did that, certainly. It has lots of other stuff, which I don't really have time to talk about. It has developer tooling of MobX. It has all of the time-traveling undo, redo magic of Redux. It has a life cycle where you can hook into its kind of internal processing and intercept things. You can capture the state of stuff, persist it maybe in local storage. Whenever we want to do like, asynchronous side effecty stuff, so in Redux we might use like Redux sagas if we're being like best practicey modern developers. MobX State Tree is something that again is so much more concise and easy to work with, called Flow, which is a terrible name in JavaScript context. But basically it allows you to write your side effecty stuff using generator functions and yielding promises. It then ensures that whenever you do an update to the model, it's kind of captured in a correct way, in a correct context. One of the other things it has is references. So I can, if I have, let's say, an issue tracker application, and I want within one issue to refer to another issue, I can have a reference to that second issue. And then when I write code, I write issue.related.first, let's say, .done equals true. And I can mutate this reference thing. Whereas in Redux, I would probably have these things in a normalized way. So I get the issue ID, then look for it in another collection, then try and do a destructured update. It would be awful. It's much nicer. Cool. So if you think it sounds interesting, and I think it is very interesting, here's some websites and resources. And Redux isn't that bad. Like I mostly use Redux. You know, if you want someone to do Redux stuff for you, you can throw money at me. I will do it for you. You know. Thank you.